what is Data Vault?
So Data Vault is a modeling technique in the same fashion as Kimball. And I know you shouldn't have dimensions more than 10 million rows, but like I live in the real world. So sometimes that happens, right? You can just use a warehouse automation tool or build your own or build scripts or whatever and automate the entire creation of the Data Vault very, very easily.
Welcome to Engaging Data Bytes. My name's Simon Meacher. I'm the founder of Engaging Data and lifetime data nerd. And today with us we have Jeandre du Toit. He's a Data Vault expert and modern data architect. We also have Carl Richards, who's the head of consultancy services here at Engaging Data and also a Data Vault practitioner. Now, before we get started, I'd like to invite everyone to raise questions in the chat as we go. We'll take all those questions and we'll put them to the guys towards the end of the session. So just to keep things quick and moving forward, I'd like to welcome Jeandre and Carl to the meeting.
Cool. Thank you, Simon. So, Jeandre, for the newcomers to Data Vault, what is Data Vault?
So Data Vault is a modeling technique in the same fashion as Kimball. But I mean, what I would like to say is that Data Vault is more than that. Data Vault is a solution to some data warehousing problems we experience in our day-to-day functioning with data platforms and stuff.
Okay, no, that's cool. And why would you choose Data Vault?
So this is a little bit weird, and maybe I'm going to do a little bit of an analogy. But if you think about Kimball as like a hammer or tools, like Data Vault is just another tool. Let's say Data Vault is a screwdriver. Now, certainly I'm not a handyman or the best kind of handyman. So I have once or twice taken a hammer to a screw and it kind of works, but I wouldn't say it's the best way to do it, right? And in the same fashion, I'd say yes. We actually have different kinds of problems and I can go into detail and we can explain that a little bit more. But Kimball solves a certain type of problem, right? It's there to make it easy or fast to select vast amounts of data. So the modeling technique that we use there is optimized for selecting data very quickly. But to doing inserts and updates and deletes, it's not, I mean, it's possible, but it's not optimized for that, if that makes sense. In the same way, if you think about third normal form is optimized for very quick inserts, updates, and deletes, because you normally use that in source systems. And inside a source system, you're only dealing with one record at a time, possibly, or a handful, but you're not working with billions of records. And so third normal form is optimized for that. Then there's something in the middle, and we can talk about that, but that's basically where I think Data Vault fits in. And Data Vault solves a different kind of problem. That problem, and this is my opinion, and this is my experience, is that in data warehousing environments, or business intelligence environments, or whatever you like to call it at the moment, we almost have two sides. We've got the source system, and most generally we've got a Kimball model, and that causes a lot of issues, and I'll explain that. The reason that causes a lot of issues is, imagine we're not in a data warehousing world. I'm talking about two different applications on the web, and I'm saying there's two different applications, and how do we interact between those two different applications? If I said to you, I'm going to hook straight into one application from the other one, you would tell me I'm crazy, because that's going to cause a whole lot of different issues and problems. Like if the systems are tightly coupled, that causes a lot of integration issues, that causes dependencies. So we don't do that in application development or programming. What we do instead is we have an abstract interface between the two different systems. And that interface is like a contract between the two systems, but that catches changes. So that means system A can independently do modifications and changes without system B having to know about it or be impacted. So if you take that and you move out back into the data warehousing world, you say, well, wait a second, we are connecting Kimball systems directly to source systems. And the way we're doing that is also something I think we all intuitively know it's not the right way of doing it. But the easiest way of doing it is to build your Kimball warehouse based on source system logic. So I mean, we all, well, at least from my experience in every single book I've read and every single blog, we're always told we must build our warehousing systems top down, right? Like I don't think too many people will disagree with that, or hope not. And there's very good reasons, we can go into that as well. But to make that Kimball model fit into the source system, we don't. We build it bottom up. Now, it's very, very high level, or maybe a little bit off topic, I guess, to the question you're asking. But what I'm getting to is I'm saying we need something in the middle between your source system and your Kimball model to abstract the Kimball model from the source system. And that thing is Data Vault. And so that's kind of why I'm saying that solves a certain problem. And the problem it's solving, or at least one of the problems it's solving, is integration. So Data Vault is very, very good at taking lots of information from different source systems and even changes, like being able to handle and adapt to different changes from the source systems and capture that in one model or location or space. And then you build your Kimball warehouses on top of that. And I think if I had to explain the analogy I started off with a little bit further is what I said, Kimball is a hammer and maybe Data Vault is a screwdriver, right? And we've got screws and we've got nails that we need to deal with in our lives. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about Data Vault, think, whoa, why do you want to replace my Kimball methodology with Data Vault? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying got different set of problems, and so just use a different set of tool. You can still use Kimball, you can still use Data Vault. Just there's a harmonious way of doing it, in the same way that we still use third normal form. We don't go to our source systems and replace that with Kimball. So use the right methodology for the right problem you're trying to solve.
So what is the physical differences between a traditional Kimball model and a Data Vault?
So I guess in normal Kimball, we've got facts and dimensions, right? I think we're all familiar with that. In Data Vault, it's split up a little bit more. You've got hubs, links, and satellites. So I almost want to say it's got 50% more tables, so it's 50% better. But of course, I'm just kidding around. The difference is again in what's the type of problem you want to solve and how this allows you to solve it. So in Kimball, we've got a lot of metric data. And so you want very narrow tables that's very, very large, and that would be your fact tables. And so you put your metric information in there, and it's optimized for fast reading. In the same way, your dimensions have contextual information, maybe not as tall, but very, very wide. And so you kind of split it up, and you can, if you understand about optimizing data, you'll see why that's optimized for reads. On the Data Vault side, we want to optimize for integration. There's a lot of other advantages we can speak about Data Vault as well, but to be able to adapt a lot quicker to business changes in different source systems and stuff, the data structure is split again according to the hubs, links, and satellites. And for now, I think to simplify it, if we forget about the satellites is just contextual information on top of Data Vault. If we just focus on the hubs and the links. And all that is hubs is basically just business keys, and links is just the relationships between those business keys. And so we split the contextual information outside into the satellites, and we can talk about that. So what the hubs and the links give us is understanding what business concepts there are and the relationships between the business concepts brings us a lot closer to actual business. So when you talk to business, and I guess the concept of, we call it Elm workshops, and that's another technical term, but it doesn't matter. What it really means is you talk to business and you say, here is your organization. What are the things that's happening inside your organization? Oh, you've got customers and you've got this specific type of product. Oh, you've got a sales process. What's the sales process? Oh, you've got a salesperson. And taking that information and relating it almost straight to the Data Vault. So we could do that, and we basically do that in these workshops with like sticky notes. And those sticky notes almost directly translate back to the hubs and links. To get back to the advantages of that is because the contextual information and the business information and the relationship information isn't encapsulated in a single table. They're separate tables. It gives us the agility and flexibility to make changes to those without impacting others. So if you think about a third normal form table, right, it's got primary keys, and it's got contextual information, and it's got relationship information because you've got foreign keys in there as well. So if you wanted to make a change to the relationship of a third normal form table to another table, you're actually impacting the entire table. Like, you can't just change the foreign key without the rest of the table not being updated. In Data Vault, we can, because we've split those different things out. So I can change relationships without changing the contextual information necessarily related with it. And what that gives us is the flexibility that if business processes change quite frequently in organization, then we'll just create different links. And you can have one link for a specific business process, and you can have another link for another one, and so forth, without having changed the hub or without having changed the satellite. Everything just keeps adapting. In the same vein, if we go to the satellite information, which is the contextual information, if we have to add additional contextual attributes, maybe there's a new source system that's come in, or maybe the source system has made changes or whatever, we can add those contextual attributes in the satellite without having impacted the relationships or the hubs. So basically what the data structure gives us in Data Vault is a lot of flexibility compared to Kimball. We can talk about the complexity as well. You can imagine now, again, with the complexity, and there is some ways around it and optimizations and tweaks. Now, I think it can get very advanced very quickly. But the pure basic structure I'm explaining to you can understand that's not necessarily optimized for reading, but it's optimized for integration. And that's why I'm saying that's a different problem we're solving with the Data Vault compared to Kimball.
One of the big things that I read about the most around Data Vault is the fact that we don't do update to data. Could you elaborate a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's actually quite an advantage if you think about it, and I can speak about some of our personal experience with it. In a way, and remember I said Data Vault can solve many different problems, and again, maybe this is just something I would highlight to the audience, right? I'm not selling Data Vault. I think what needs to be clear is Data Vault solves a certain set of problems. If you don't have those problems, it would be irresponsible of me to say you need Data Vault. And I say in certain circumstances where it wouldn't make sense is if you only have a single source system. Now, of course, in the future, you could have additional source systems, but let's say you only have a single source system. Then to build a Kimball model off of that is super easy. If you have an organization that doesn't change business processes, I don't know, you're selling ice creams. You sold ice creams yesterday, you're going to sell ice creams 5 years from now. Your business process is set in stone, not changing. Don't need Data Vault. You're not in a regulated environment, you're not going to be audited, you don't need to keep history, you don't need Data Vault. You're working with small amounts of data, your data warehouse could basically be inside of Excel. You probably don't need Data Vault. My experience though, in all the companies I've worked at, lots of different source systems over many different instances across different countries. They regulate it. I have to keep auditing information. Business constantly changes business processes because they're actually in a environment where they're competing with other organizations, which means we have to keep adapting and keep changing. In that kind of scenario, and we're dealing with a lot of data, and we're dealing at quick frequencies, right? So again, everything I've seen, or most of the places I've worked at or worked with, Kimball models are generally built once a day in a batch mode. I think half the reason is because of complexities. It takes a very long time to load the Kimball models. With Data Vault, we can load a lot quicker, a lot more frequently. The advantages we get with that is you can load data out of order. You can have late arriving data. Your data is fully audited. Now I'm going off on a tangent. Basically, the reason you don't do updates is to allow all of these attributes I'm talking about. Because if you are doing updates to the data structures or to the data, then what would happen is you have to have blockers, if that makes sense. So if you think about, if you're updating a table, you're going to have a table lock on that. And you can't update it and someone else update it simultaneously, and there's blocks. And I think, and that's what I want to speak about in my personal experience, what makes Data Vault nice, because you can't update stuff, you can only insert or you can only extend it, right? You can't update, but you can extend. Makes it also a lot easier for, let's call it a distributed warehouse team or BI team to work on Data Vault. You can only add, you can't ever go and update. So the other advantages of that is, again, what I was speaking about earlier, when you've got a Kimball model, that Kimball model is very much, or it should be, built according to business processes. If the business decides to change the business process, like what do you do? Do you go and update your facts and dimensions to cater for this new business process? Or do you create more facts and dimensions? You say, oh, I've got DIM customer, but that DIM customer was for the old process. So now I'm going to create a new DIM customer. I mean, if you do that gets very messy, right? The other way around, if you update the old DIM customer for the new process, you now lose historical data possibly. So that's the advantages of only extending Data Vault. I'll give you an example. And again, maybe it's just my terrible luck that I work in places where a source system sends you dodgy data, and then a week later it says, our bad. You remember about 7 days ago we sent you something, we made a boo-boo, but we fixed it now. Now, how do you deal with that? And again, generally what I've seen is in Kimball models, people are like, oh, well, now we're going to have to delete the last 7 days worth of data in the dimension and then start loading 7 days ago. And then incrementally for every single day, we're basically building. So it's not too bad if you don't have a lot of data. But I've actually seen instances where people made a mistake a year ago. And then we have to reload a year's worth of data in a dimension. And the dimension is massive, and the facts are massive, and the amount of data is massive, which literally takes like 2 or 3 months for us to reload the dimension. So what we'd normally do is we just do it in parallel to the current dimension. Right at the end, when we've now done everything we needed to do, we'll do an old switcheroo and swap it out. And that's not very clean. Now we've done all of that work, we've fixed the dirty data, and an auditor comes and says, whoa, in January, you sent out a report saying you've got X amount of sales. But when I'm looking at your data warehouse right now, when I pull the report for January, those numbers don't match. Why is that? And you couldn't tell them because you've taken all of the information and you've updated it. Whereas in Data Vault, you don't update. You'll just insert the new data that's fixed, right? And so hopefully it's not all 10 billion records. Hopefully it's only a couple of records. But at least if an auditor comes, like we've got a concept of business effective date and also load date. And that forms part of your primary key to some extent. So if an auditor comes, you can say, yes, right now, this is what the data looks like for January today. But I can also show you what the data looks like for January, in January. Like we haven't lost anything. We've kept full auditability and traceability. And I guess that's the power of not doing updates and only doing inserts.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeandre. I'm going to hand over to Simon now, who's got a couple of questions from the group.
Thank you very much, guys. So the first, I've got a couple of questions from Chris. How would you approach data classification within Data Vault? Would you do anything special to the design?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I would cater for it in the design, or you'd cater for it in the design. But in terms of the classification, I know maybe this gets a little bit more technical or a little bit more advanced, but at least from my perspective, I would build my model to integrate with data management a lot better. So like your master data information needs to be modeled correctly. And again, that would just be a different source into Data Vault. When I'm building my Data Vault models, I don't differentiate or distinguish between different source systems and say this one is the best or not. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat on that, but let's just say we'll treat all source systems as if they are source system, because at the point where I'm pulling data into the Data Vault, I'm not implicitly trusting a single source system. I trust no source system, and that's why I just want to capture everything.
I think that's very wise. Don't trust anything you see.
Then in terms of the data catalog and reference data, I'm also quite passionate about reference data coming into the Data Vault. Again, I don't necessarily want to go into the technical detail of implementing, but the ideal thing would be, and there's definitely certain ways of doing it, where you build your model in such a way that business actually has the advantage of changing classifications and stuff on your proper master data platform, and that then feeding through into the Data Vault very quickly. Now again, if I'm going to use an example of a dimension, if you had a massive dimension, and I know you shouldn't have dimensions more than 10 million rows, but like I live in the real world. So sometimes that happens, right? If you have a customer type that customer type is now going to be shown across, let's say, 10 million customers or 100 million customers or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Now you're saying, oh, actually, the customer type shouldn't be VIP. It should be very important person. Do that. You've now introduced a change in all 10 million or 100 million or 20 million records. And your data warehouse has now exploded. And you've got the historical information and the new information. But so if we're talking in terms of that kind of physical data classification, if you will, inside of Data Vault, the way I would have implemented it, it would have been a separate concept saying, oh, customer type it's its own thing. And it would have been a table of 7 records, one for VIP or whatever.
Yeah.
And I would have changed one record. Immediately, the entire warehouse would have adapted to that change. So I'm not quite sure if that's the question that was asked, but that's certainly an interesting thing to think about anyway.
Yeah, that's given me a different perspective straight away. Because I was thinking putting it over the tools, metadata and stuff like that, whereas actually that's cool. So there's another question from Chris where I guess he's got a specific thought in mind. Is it possible to split your data vault into separate parts across many databases to help control access to data, i.e. HR and business data? So I think there's a use case there. And that's something we've come across in Kimball and, when we've implemented data platforms, there's always that security aspect that, some people need access to data, some people don't. And I guess what Chris is asking is, can you break it across technology or maybe databases?
Yeah, so conceptually, 100% you could. I mean, in terms of performance or architecturally, I'm not too sure if I would do that. But I mean, that's a very good question, because that brings another advantage of Data Vault. If you look at the way we design Data Vault, again, like I said, we're talking about business processes, and generally business processes would naturally be little pockets, right? You wouldn't normally have a business process that depends on something on the far side of the organization. Like everything, if you're making a sale, customer would be there and the employee would be there and the cash register, like everything you need is right there in that pocket. And so you can 100% have different pockets of information. In fact, I'd say to an extent that's kind of what Data Vault expects. And because you can have different pockets, and just to give some experience from a team I worked in before, we used to have a very large data warehouse team that was split by business unit. So we used to have, I don't know, let's say 10 different squads, and every squad used to have data engineers and business analysts and maybe a data scientist and perhaps an architect assisting them. And every squad was focused on one aspect of the organization. One squad would do products, one squad would do finance, one squad would do credit, or whatever the case may be. So from a business side, you can split it. From a technology side, because remember, you just have different pockets of data, and it's really like the main thing, or to me, one of the magical things. Let me not say the main thing, but the magical thing is these links. That link is just, let's call it some form of a coupling mechanism that says data over here relates to data over there. You could technically have that link split across extreme technologies. Again, from a solution architect perspective, I'd say, whoa, let's just hold on. But conceptually and out of an interesting topic, you could have a link on one system that's referencing data in a different data vault altogether in a completely different system. So the link could, on the one side, talk about primary keys in integers, and the second part of the link that says the relationship it's referencing could be a API key somewhere in the cloud. You can 100% technically make that work. If it's a good idea or not, we can discuss it. But the advantage of that, and that's the interesting thing to me always, is you could literally have 50 data vaults, and it could be in different teams or different departments or different business units, and all of them could actually still be speaking to one another through these links. Again, is that a good idea? I don't know. We'd have to discuss specifics. Then I'd like to go a little bit deeper into the data vault. Now, I was talking about the business units. What's even nicer or more impressive to me is if you think about a table like DIM customer, it's one big wide table with like 500 columns, possibly, I don't know, just an arbitrary example. In Data Vault, your contextual information is inside of satellites. Your customer hub could have one satellite, or it could have 100 Okay, obviously don't do 100 satellites, please. That's too many. But the point is, you can have multiple satellites. You could even say a concept like a customer has different satellites. This one satellite's got PII information. Only a subset of people is allowed to see that or work on that. Oh, another satellite, yeah, it's really customer information from a finance perspective. Let a finance team deal with that.
Yeah.
Oh, the third satellite is, HR has some attributes they want to worry about a customer, whatever the case may be. So even down to a lower level granularity, you can split satellites up according to business processes or teams, and also functions, right? So if you had that PII satellite I was talking about on customer, or anything else really, when a customer comes and says or invokes their right to be forgotten, you literally just go and delete the record in that satellite. So all the legal requirement you have to get rid of that data, you've done without losing the business value. I think we've spoken about some of that stuff before, Simon.
We have, yeah.
And so there's interesting ways that you can hack it, or I don't want to say hack it, but you can push it to the extreme where you can really have randomized data that no one can go and figure out what the customer was, but without losing the benefit of that.
Yeah, and that topic by itself is probably another couple of hours of discussion. But I think you've answered that really, especially going down to the PIR data, and that's what I think Chris was going on about. But when I was reading that, I was starting to think, and my question for you is around Data Vault and AI and ML. But I think you might have covered some of that inside your last question. But so, what are your thoughts around how Data Vault can help AI and ML as a function?
Yeah, obviously the different types of structures and stuff I was talking about. So again, you have, let me not make it any more complex. I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
Basically, we've split up the data in a way inside the Data Vault into smaller compartments, if that makes sense. Now, if you think about machine learning or artificial intelligence, of that 100 columns inside, DIM customer necessarily, we've now done, feature engineering, and we've realized we only really need 5 or 6 of those attributes. You don't, and I know we do this in Kimball, and it's, in a way, it's fun to build this massive table, and you have every answer that anyone could possibly ask in this table. But that's not always necessary, right? So the fact is, we in our Data Vault might have 5 satellites that describes a customer with 100 different attributes, but the machine learning models only really need 6 or 7 of those attributes. And so you can have, and it doesn't have to be a Kimball model either. This is what I was saying earlier. If you have a problem, pick the right tool for the problem. So what we built with the Data Vault is, and maybe this is not the most technically correct way of describing it, but I like to think of it like this. I've abstracted the source system. So what I've done is I've taken 10 source systems and I've converted it into one source system. So now I've got one source system that can supply whatever else. So that source system is now the source system for Kimball. And I can use Kimball and build models that is adequate for business. But now I also have the exact same source system that's, taken all the pain out of integration, all the complexity and stuff. And I can use it for machine learning, right? And for machine learning, maybe I don't need a DIM customer. Maybe I actually just need one massive flat file that's got customer and product and accounting or credit information or finance or whatever. And it's got 60 attributes in one flat file. And that's fine. It gives me the flexibility to make those changes. And just on the Kimball one, while I'm speaking on the topic, we found that we were able to iterate Kimball models insanely fast because it's built on top of the Data Vault. In fact, when you make a mistake, and this is the thing about Kimball that I've always found interesting, is like everyone wants to work agile, everyone's like claiming to work agile, and we have scrums and sprints and stuff, and that's interesting. But when you're building a Kimball warehouse, you almost have to do it in a waterfall fashion because you have to know upfront what's everything that's involved. If you make a mistake, and this is why people spend so much time upfront designing their warehouse, or at least they should be if they're doing Kimball, is if you did it wrong, the pain of fixing it is enormous. Because we now have a single source system. Remember earlier when I said, if you only have one source, you probably don't need Data Vault. Well, I've now taken all my complexity of sources and made it one source, which makes Kimball development insanely easy. And because the Kimball development is very easy, I can very quickly adapt and iterate. And I don't need to understand the information up front in full detail. Now, there's a caveat, and I'm surprised no one's asked this, which is probably good or probably bad. There is a drawback to Data Vault. It's not all, all perfect, all amazing. It is extremely complicated to build it by hand. Yeah. So even though it's only 3 tables, and I'm joking, it's like slightly bigger than Kimball, there's definitely some technology barriers in terms of implementing it. You can 100% do it by hand, but you shouldn't, because it's exploding the tables. And I know, again, I joked about it, but whereas in a Kimball model, you'll have DIM customer, which is 1 table. In Data Vault, that might be like 10 different tables. If you encapsulate the hub and the satellite or satellites and possibly different links, and then the staging tables and stuff you need to create that, it can be 10 tables, 15, 20 tables just to show your customer information. So if you're trying to implement it by hand, it's going to be very slow and tedious, and you're probably going to want to murder me. Please don't do that. The advantage of Data Vault, again, in that instance, is there's a lot of repeatability and patterns. And so if ever you've thought about data warehousing automation, I'm just going to stop there for a second, because I'm fanatical about data warehouse automation, and a lot of people are like, no, why? We can do it by hand. We can do this. And I almost want to challenge everyone on the call. Like, I bet you're using data warehouse automation to some extent. You just don't realize it. And I'll give you an example. How many of you wake up 2 o'clock every morning to kick off your ETL? Like, I'm betting no one. I bet everyone has got some automated process to kick off the warehouse. So you're already using automation, and you already understand the benefit of automation. I'm saying just take it to the next level. Why build your Data Vault when there's repeatable patterns? You can just use a warehouse automation tool, or build your own, or build scripts or whatever, and automate the entire creation of the Data Vault very, very easily. Anyway, that I went off on a tirade there again.
No. I think you're absolutely right. I think, like you've got a selection and a choice of what modeling technique you use, you've also got a choice of what tools you want. And I think ultimately we're here to try and do as much as possible without having as much as, we all want to get to the complicated stuff and try and solve the most complicated puzzle. And automation gets you to that point so much quicker, helps you re-engineer if you ever need to do that, which I'm like you, I'm fanatical about it as well.
Just on that topic, sorry to interrupt you, but I just say, like, if we look at my experience with data warehousing, is we're spending 80% of our time on integration and 20% of our time on doing clever stuff. Like, some people don't even do prescriptive or predictive analytics. We wish we did, but we're spending all of our time on integration, and that's maybe why I'm so passionate, because to me it's like, it's crazy. It's a problem that's been solved. Like, let's move on. The quicker we can do integration, the more time we can spend on the fancy warehousing.
Completely agree. Well, look, this has been a fascinating introduction to Data Vault. So thank you, Jeandre. Thank you, Carl, for taking us through that. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Look out for the next Engaging Data Bite. Thank you, Jeandre, again, and thank you, Carl.